A believer in the bliss of solitude, Ralph Waldo Emerson has this rather intimidating thing to say about preaching in his essay, Self-Reliance. I like the silent church before the service begins better than any preaching. Well, Mr. Emerson, I'm going to open up my mouth and break this blessed silence to wrestle a little bit with this idea of self-reliance you praise so heartily. Looking out at his home congregation, Emerson tells his readers that he savors the vision of the congregation sitting in their silent, detached silos. In his words, how far off, how cool, how chaste the persons look, begirt one with a precinct or a sanctuary. He praises that safe bit of personal space that each person claimed as they waited in the church. A brilliant writer and sharp of wit, Ralph Waldo Emerson has long been seen as one of our Unitarian heroes. Serving as a leader to the Transcendentalists, Emerson took part in the birthing of new thoughts, ushering in an era of engaged spirituality and examined ideas with his radical and iconoclastic sense of the world. Ralph Waldo Emerson was born on May 25th of 1803, the fourth of 8 children. His family prized education, learning, and culture, and his father, William Emerson, was a distinguished minister at the First Church Boston. His family was intimate with the Boston intellectuals of the era, among them William Ellery Channing, George Buckminster, Henry Ware Sr., and Edward Everett. Emerson's father died when Waldo was 8, leaving the family without financial support. So his mother, Ruth, sold her husband's library, took in boarders, worked as a maid, and often struggled to put food on their table. Waldo and his brother Charles had only one overcoat between them, and taunting schoolmates would ask the young Emerson, "Whose turn is it to wear the great coat today?" Now, that would certainly make someone long for personal space and silence. Emerson proceeded to follow in his father's path. He studied the classics as a young boy, attended Harvard, and served as his class poet. After a stint working as a finishing school instructor, Emerson left teaching and entered into ministry at Harvard Divinity School. He was licensed to preach in 1826. The essay Self-Reliance is one of Emerson's most famous pieces. It's required reading for all of those who are on the path to UU ministry. The essay emerged in 1839, materializing over the course of several years from pieces of sermons that Emerson had preached. In the essay, Emerson sings the praises of making one's way in the world with a deep value for independence and gumption. To Emerson, one must believe what is true within and resist what a society is telling a person to do. A wise person, says Emerson, believes that envy is ignorance, that imitation is suicide, and calls out to his readers with his key message, trust thyself. Emerson believed that society is a conspiracy against every one of its members, as society asks us to conform to its demands. An iconoclast at his core, Emerson instructs us that conformity is just plain wrong, and that we must strike out on our own if we are to avoid being bogged down by the mire of others. As he said, nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind. There's a gratifying core in Emerson's Self-Reliance, the idea that we each have value to offer the world. He argues that each person is unique and that we are responsible to cultivate what is best in ourselves. We can see this notion of the living, breathing sense of love and virtue within us all in the portion of the essay, The Oversoul, that we read as a responsive reading this morning. He inspires the readers of his essays, even some 200 years later, to think deeply and see how each one of us should relish the freedom of thought, to seek solitude for our personal reflection and allow our ideas to flow. Emerson was a lifelong journal keeper, and he set aside time to look closely at what was going on in his own mind. He could track the emergence of new concepts and develop them over time as he prized his internal debate. He listened well to his ideas and gave them room to take grander shape. He called his journals his savings bank. Unitarian Universalists over the past 2 centuries have heard Emerson's call to self-reliance and answered well, though I would argue that that is often at our peril. UU Minister Forrest Church spoke about Emerson in an illuminating way in an article he wrote for UU World a number of years ago. In the article, Church takes a look at our infatuation as UUs with the life and work of Ralph Waldo Emerson and points out there are some shortcomings to Emerson's views. Emerson believed firmly in self-reliance, was an early user of the term self-help, and a firm believer in the independence of solitude. But Emerson's anti-institutionalist view did not add to the sense of community in his church, or in some ways as the Unitarian Church as a whole. Speaking of our continued reverence for Emerson, Forrest Church makes an interesting point, saying, to build an institution on a foundation laid by an anti-institutionalist like Emerson is a little bit like hiring a demolition expert as one's architect. Emerson stood aloof, and it cost him a sense of comfort and ease, a level of self-compassion that might have allowed him to feel a little more at home in the world. As a fierce individualist, Emerson fed the notion that we can think our way out of every dilemma that life gives us, and that we can do that alone. Continuing in this self-reliant vision is doing ourselves and our movement a disservice. By fostering the notion that a life can be well lived in a silo of individualism, we lock ourselves into ivory towers that cut us off from the sunlight of the Spirit and from the realities of life. Loss was all about Ralph Waldo Emerson, and perhaps to protect his heart, Emerson built walls with his mind. 2 of his brothers and his very young wife died of tuberculosis, all within the span of a very few short years. Emerson remarried, and not long thereafter, his young son died in childhood. Loss and heartache followed Emerson through his young adult years, and they had an impact on how he saw the world. Everyone handles loss and grief in their own way, but from outward appearances, it seemed that Emerson felt his ivory tower could save him from hurt. As I reread Emerson's essay, I got to thinking about self-reliance and how I meet the world. Several years ago, I left a job that I had just decided it was time to leave, and I had not yet begun my studies in seminary, and so I had time to hike quite a bit. And one of my favorite spots to go is Windy Hill in Portola Valley. It's a magical place of steep hills, trees and streams that are heaven on earth to my dog Ginger and to me. One morning, Ginger and I headed out, climbing up the Hams Gulch Trail. I was wearing my headset and using my eyes to take in the scenery, but my mind was elsewhere. We meandered a couple of miles up the hills and through trees into an area that had just opened up where the ridgeline was. The trees were pretty dense at that place, and so my eyes were adjusting to what I was seeing when Ginger stopped in her tracks. She is a dog who believes in being in perpetual motion, so this alarmed me. And every bit of fur on her 42-pound body stood on end. And I looked at her and thought, this is odd and a bit frightening. At this point, my eyes drifted to where Ginger was looking, and I saw a gigantic paw come out of the bushes. It was a mountain lion. My first thought was, what did that sign in the parking lot say to do? It said to make yourself look as big as possible. So I took out my headphones, I grabbed my sweatshirt from off my waist and held it above my head, trying to make myself look 7 feet tall. And then I remembered that sign said something else. It said something about making noise. And I thought, I'm so scared. How am I going to make noise? And then I thought, I'll sing. I can sing. What'll I sing? And then it occurred to me, I'll sing that Monty Python classic, I'm a lumberjack and I'm okay. I know it sounds silly, but it really worked. Singing gave me the bravery to speak out, and I think I needed to hear my own self say, I'm okay. It was a goofy song, and it made me feel brave. And my fears were held in check so that my mind was able to function, and the mountain lion turned and retreated up the hill. And Ginger and I continued on the trail, kind of walking backwards so that we could make sure we were seeing where the mountain lion retreated. And then when I noticed my cell phone had service return again, I slowed myself down again and looked at my phone and decided I need to call my husband. And I called him and said, "Oh my gosh, you will never believe what Ginger and I just saw." And he commiserated with me. And later that afternoon, I called the Mid-Peninsula Open Space District and told them about having seen a mountain lion on my hike. So 2 things happened here. I did what I could to be responsible for myself and my own well-being, relying on myself to do what I needed to do. The other important part about this story is that I couldn't wait to tell the people I loved and who support me, how very scared I had been. Shortly thereafter, I told anyone who would listen about the experience. I needed a sense of connection to make sense of it all, to know I was safe, that I was okay, and that what happens to me matters. I felt anxious and alone and very vulnerable on that hill, and my community of church friends and community friends helped me to make sense of that very scary moment. Social worker and researcher and storyteller Brené Brown has given a couple of TED Talks, and I'm a big podcast listener. I heard one of hers recently on vulnerability. Brown names the willingness to be authentic and vulnerable with others as the most essential thing we can do to make connection in our lives. Brené Brown urges her listeners to break free of the idea that it's shameful to be vulnerable, pressing the message that we must let others know when we have failed, when we have made a mistake, we've hurt someone or felt scared and alone, or struggled with our mental or physical health. She argues that a beneficial approach to the world is to let go of what you feel you should be and be who you are and be truly yourself. Our covenant helps us to do that in a healthy framework here, giving us structure in our ways we engage with one another. By letting ourselves be seen by our church community, the people who have pledged to travel with us on life's sacred journey, we break down the barriers to real connection. It's countercultural, but hey, we UUs are pretty good at counterculture. I'm someone who loves words, and I'd point out as an aside that the word religion is linked to the word ligament, the connective tissues that hold together our body. We know we are connected on a sacred journey together. Now, Emerson might admire this as a fine thought, and perhaps he'd acknowledge feeling a sense of connection, sitting in that silence with his sacred community in the time before the sermon started. But I'd say we need to go deeper, that we need to do more than merely admire the connection. As a faith community that does not press a creed or a collective statement we have agreed upon intellectually, we act out our tradition, standing together in connection, holding each other in our hearts in a deep way. We celebrate and we mourn with each other as we journey through this life. We share our joys and our sorrows. And the only way that this can happen is we risk being vulnerable with one another. Writer Anne Lamott tells in one of her essays why she insists upon taking her son Sam to church with her. She says, first off, I make him go because I can. I outweigh him by nearly 75 pounds. But then Lamott gets serious. Most of the people who have what I want, which is to say purpose, heart, balance, gratitude, and joy, are people with a deep sense of spirituality. They're people in community who pray or practice their faith. They're Buddhist, they're Jews, they're Christians. People banding together to work on themselves and for human rights. They follow a brighter light than the glimmer of their own candle. They're part of something beautiful. As our movement steps more fully into the 21st century, we celebrate ways of being that lead us into community. We embrace the practice of healthy vulnerability and genuine authenticity that can lead us to greater interdependence. We take Emerson's bright gift of insight and we add our light to it, stepping out from the shadow of self-reliance into a glowing and growing beacon of spiritual wholeness and integrity. May it be so.